One other aspect that I focused on early on in terms of what the game is about that I was not completely successful with was the following thing. Not only is this a puzzle game, not an action game, but what does that mean? Let's come up with a strong statement about what that means, because the stronger and clearer the statement, the more it can guide design decisions. Whereas the statement, this is a puzzle game, not an action game, is not necessarily, again, actionable in the sense that there still needs to be some more steps between that and telling you the answer to decisions.
Right.
Right? Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Braid Anniversary Edition podcast, episode 4. This time we have Casey Muratori back as the interviewer and me as the interviewee, and we're going to talk about game design. And one of the main topics of discussion is the way that I made design decisions early on when figuring out what game Braid should be. I made some decisions that were pretty unintuitive, in that I chose not to follow relatively well-established guidelines about what you should do when you want to design a game and have it be good. I did something else instead. We'll get into details about what those ideas about design were, and why I didn't think they were appropriate for Braid, and hopefully it'll make a pretty interesting discussion. I'm also in an interesting mood right now. This is the first one of these introductions that we've recorded after Braid Anniversary Edition's been published. So it's out. You can play it. If you like the kind of thing that we talk about here, there's lots more of this kind of discussion in the game with illustrations, and there are new puzzles and all sorts of good stuff. You can get the game on every major console or on Steam. And if you're a Netflix subscriber, you can play on your phone just as part of your subscription fee. It doesn't cost anything extra. So go ahead and give it a try, and I hope you enjoy the game. Now, let's get into the discussion.
I'm not really sure where we should pick back up, but let me suggest the following.
Okay.
When you first start designing this game, you went on vacation, and you found that, like, one thing kind of led to another, and very quickly it built out to something approximating worlds 2, 3, and 4, with the sort of exception that you had included a Y equals time level.
I think so.
Which eventually got removed, but otherwise it's sort of similar. It's like 2 is what 2 is in the release game. I mean, obviously they've been refined and all that, but the meaning of the worlds and what happens in them, 2, 3, and 4 happen. You even have the text in there, not the final text, but text that's like sort of similar.
Well, and the text is, we could clarify, it's in a different form than you see it in the final game, right? In the final game, it's in a somewhat interactive screen where you run by some books on podiums and it changes the text between stuff. Back then, it was more like the minimal thing you would have to put text into the game. So there would be, before each level, just a screen that's, not in the game. It's just a different mode, and it's like press spacebar to start the level or whatever, but there's a bunch of text. And in general, it was, all the text for that world on the screen. So it was like a bigger text dump, and you couldn't really go back and read it if you skipped it. And all these things that you would expect from a relatively short amount of effort on a game. Yeah.
Now, that doesn't really explain then where the extra worlds came from. So there are more worlds than that in Braid. And so what I wanted to kind of ask was, could we maybe walk through a little bit more of the design process that followed as to were there other things that were happening that might be interesting to discuss? And, just kind of right off the bat, one thing comes to mind, which is that you removed Y equals T.
Yeah, that's not the only thing I removed.
So maybe if you could talk about sort of how the design progressed from there before we start talking about any specific thing.
Well, so a general statement about what I'm doing the whole time is having ideas which may be high level or vague about, wouldn't it be interesting if time became this way? And I should point out as well, like I said, even going into that vacation, the idea was more like, it's generally a physics game. And Rewind is like one element of it. But I think even by the end of that prototype from the initial week, by the time I had 2 more worlds with Rewind, and the worlds weren't like worlds full of puzzles, but they were worlds with a few things to do each, and I could sort of imagine where you would go from there. It didn't feel like I was out of ideas, right? So then I thought, well, okay, maybe we're just focusing on Rewind, right? I realized that very early.
Okay, so sometime even on the vacation or shortly thereafter, were you like, I probably don't need to add anything else, like just time will give me everything I need to keep adding mechanics to this game?
I think on the vacation, I was probably mostly cranking on the thing.
Okay.
And then afterward, there's a little bit of reflection like, oh, yeah, okay, this is what this means.
Okay.
I mean, maybe that's even an overstatement of it, because as soon as you decide, like, hey, I'm going to have another world with Rewind exempt objects, and I'm going to have another world where time is tied to space, you're already starting to take up the structure of the game that would have been other phenomena, right?
It's almost like you kind of stumbled into that as just, hey, I need to add these things, and then I'm going to do this. And then when you stop and look back, you're like, oh, well, that's kind of what the game is now.
Yeah.
Like that's just what had to happen for what I was doing, and it's like, that's just better.
Well, you could imagine sticking to the original idea and like, okay, there's also going to be like quantum superposition or something.
Yeah.
And then if the structure of the game is that Rewind now has some number of worlds, then maybe there's a 2-tiered structure.
Yeah.
Where now there's quantum superposition that also has to have some number of worlds and
Yep.
whatever. And that's a little bit more like what the structure of The Witness was like, is less regular of a structure than that.
Yes.
But, you know, I did have this mindset that I wanted the game to be scopable to something that I would complete in a relatively short time. In fact, the original idea was to do the game in something like a year.
Which design-wise, it sort of
Design-wise, it did,
Yeah.
right? And we could maybe talk about that in a little
Yeah.
bit. But I remember also just, you know, I had done this prototype in December, January, and I was working on Happy Cake and stuff after that, and it was GDC time and whatever. And so it was by April that I really started working on it full time. And I had this idea like, okay, by December 31st, I'll finish the game, which of course it actually went much longer than that.
Right.
But I believe I was also kind of racing with you, if I remember correctly.
Racing with me?
Because you'd had Sushi Bar Samurai or something.
Yes.
Or your current idea was that you were going to finish it by the end of the year.
Yes.
So I was like, I'm going to also have a game it wasn't exactly a race, but like, I'm going to get my game done by the end of the year also. It's like, you know, when you have this thing where you've had a bunch of projects that don't really go where you want them to, it's useful to employ motivators wherever you can get them. And so I think that was one of them.
Okay.
I think it was the first version of Sushi Bar Samurai. I don't actually remember now. So maybe it was something else.
Well, Sushi Bar Samurai basically shipped one a month from 2005 January.
Yeah.
Every month.
Yeah.
The game sucked, but like that's what happened.
I actually had
and
fun
then,
with a couple of those versions. I think there were 1 or 2 in the middle that would have been good. But
well, if you had designed them, they would have been. So
you know, but I think the point you were iterating these versions of the game. I think with some, I remember hearing some plan from you about like, I'll get to the end of it by like the end of the year.
Yeah. I mean, I would have liked to have done that for sure. I mean, and you know.
Yeah. But so that was the expected cadence. And I don't think I had firmed up on that schedule during the original prototype, but something like that was what I had in mind. Like a year is a long time to make a game.
Yeah.
You know, so Quake was one of the more notorious games that took a lot of research and development prior to this. And that, I believe, was 1 year and 3 quarters or something.
It was, something like 18 months or something
including
like
all
that.
the initial research and stuff leading into it. And they had documented all that and stuff. And they gave a speech at GDC. I actually remember Abrash gave this speech about how they did Quake, right?
Yeah.
This was earlier than Braid time, but it sticks in the memory.
Yeah.
And there was a question, first question from the audience, right? Someone raises their hand. He says, calls on them, and they say, if I want to follow in these footsteps and do it what you have figured out, how long is that going to take?
I see.
And he said, I think it would be about the same 18 months. And there was just a hush went over the room.
Awesome.
Like this was such a terrible prospect and unheard of.
Right.
This was like 1998 or whatever.
Right.
Which is weird because there were notorious games like Mech Warrior 2 that had taken like 5 years or whatever. But in general, nobody wanted to spend 18 months on a game at that time. Now, fast forwarding to like 8 years later or whatever it was, 6 years later, I think that was more normalized. But myself as an indie on like a limited budget and again, I had all these friends who had started projects that just sort of trailed off and never got done. And I had done that at smaller scale. And one way to prevent that from happening is to make sure the schedule isn't that long, right? So that was the plan. And it sort of went that way, but maybe getting ahead of myself a little bit. By the end of the year, I had a playable game.
Yes.
From end to end. Before we talk in detail about that, I can go back and finish answering your other question. But at that point that I had a playable game, I also looked at it and said, oh, well, this can be better now than what it is. I see how to improve it. And I kept seeing very good ways to improve it, for a while.
And when you say very good ways to improve it, just for folks who don't know, what exactly are you talking about? Because are you talking about the art? Are you talking about the design? Are you talking about everything? What do you mean?
Really everything. So the art is an obvious one, right?
Right, because there really wasn't an artist.
Programmer art at that time. I had made animations and stuff, but they were programmer animations.
Right.
Nobody was going to give this Game of the Year award in the art category.
Right.
Design-wise, I believe I actually should go back and look, but I'm pretty sure I had most of the worlds, or possibly even all of them, represented to some degree. Like, there's just some puzzles in each one. And then there's you kind of want to flesh it out and figure out the structure of the game. And if these are, puzzles made out of puzzle pieces like they were at the time, you need to have enough to make a puzzle in each world.
Right.
And even if that weren't the constraint, it's still awkward maybe at a game of that size to have some areas with a lot of puzzles and some with a few. Although, again, with The Witness, I made the opposite decision, but that works better because of the structure of that game being bigger and there was a decision.
What do you mean by
on,
the opposite decision?
Well, in Braid, it's very regular, right? There are 12 puzzle pieces in each world.
Okay.
Right?
Okay.
And so if a world doesn't have 12 puzzle pieces, maybe I'm not done designing it.
I see.
And in The Witness, it was more like, going into it, I see that the design space is going to be more irregular than that. So I'm simply going to avoid any structure of that kind.
Because basically, you'd have to cut too many puzzles or add too many puzzles to some of the sections if you tried to pick the median number or something and have everything hit that. It just wasn't going to work.
Right. Even in Braid, there's probably a little bit of that. There are probably, if I thought harder on some worlds, there are really good puzzles that could be there, but I was done thinking about it because there were 12.
12. Gotcha.
Right?
Okay.
And then the worst thing than that actually is I don't have 12, and so I need to start to make filler, right?
Right.
And that's sort of why the number is 12. It's because that was the degree to which I found that I didn't really need filler to have enough.
So maybe some world in Braid would really have liked to have been 13 or 14, but it was just better to go, okay, the world where I have the least ideas for puzzles, they hit about 12, so we're just going to call it 12 and because I want it to be regular.
Yeah, and I probably made the decision for 12 provisionally before I had that verification.
I see.
But it was a guess that turned out to be okay.
Gotcha.
Yeah. Anyway, so with regard to how did I come up with the different worlds, I just had ideas. And of course, I would have an initial guess about whether this was a good idea.
Right.
And some ideas are interesting, but seem like they're going to hit a brick wall really fast. Some ideas are sound cool as a high level idea, but I couldn't even find a way to make it actionable, like a mechanic again, right?
Can you give any examples? Do you remember any of these ideas that basically got tabled because they didn't work out?
Well, I could start by talking about ones that I actually implemented.
Okay.
Well, there's two. So you already mentioned the T equals Y, right?
Right.
Which is mildly different from T equals X, right? It's the same implementation detail technically. It's like you just decide the other axis is controlling the thing. And interactively, it's a little bit different because it's cute that, you jump. And so jumping has an up part and a down part. So a jump automatically has a forward in time and a backward in time piece.
Yes.
Right? Now, the thing is, the jumps are pretty short in the game. They're like much shorter than Mario jumps for reasons.
Okay. What reasons?
We could put a bullet point on that and come back. It's a pretty big discussion.
All right.
That with the other objects in the game, so the primary other object I'm looking at, so that the level that was in the early version of the game was the little monster guys being shot out of cannons, right?
Yes.
And because if they're walking very slowly, in the amount of time that a jump takes, they don't go very far. And so they'll go forward and back, but there's just not much of a state change that happens there, right? On the other hand, if I shot them out of cannons, if the velocity is really fast that they get shot at, then they'll change appreciably over a time frame like that.
Right.
But then it becomes kind of hostile to play. And so this one level that I made was you're climbing up a trellis and there's cannons shooting across it and you're sort of trying to navigate around, find the path up that will not result in you being beamed, right? Which is in some sense, a static solution for that exists because at any Y coordinate, there will be monsters at any XY coordinate, right?
Right.
But to make that work, like I said, I had to shoot the monsters out pretty fast, and it was a relatively unfriendly level.
Okay.
And I didn't have a lot of other ideas for it.
Right.
And also, the general tenor of the rest of the game is the levels are horizontal and they're a little bit vertical enough to make interesting situations. And suddenly, when T equals Y, it's like, well, you end up with levels that are probably really tall.
Okay.
Probably. I mean, maybe I could have thought more about it and avoided that. Or at least levels where you go up to the top and all the way back down and up to the top and all the way back down.
Right.
And, I was just thinking about what are the possibilities there. And I never came up with anything. Like, there's always this thing where you start with an idea and it's not working out that well. But maybe if you get over some hump and find a few things, it'll click better, right? It's like two atoms forming a molecule. It's like maybe they repel each other, but then you get them into the correct energy well and they'll like snap into an equilibrium, right?
Right.
Sometimes design is like that. And for that thing, I just didn't ever find it. And so then there was still the idea I could keep it in the T equals X world just as an ending thing to make it a little bit different. And that just like a little punctuation on the end, like a surprise. But the other worlds don't have something like that. And it just wasn't that good in the end, right? So yeah, I didn't. And also, like some of the other monsters, there's almost no interaction with at all. Like in the very beginning of the game, I don't think there were the plant monsters that go up and down. But those were added not too long after, I don't think.
Right.
And unless I made horizontal ones...
Right.
There's almost no interaction you can have.
Right.
Between climbing upward and avoiding those monster guys. I mean, it could be that they would kill or don't kill like other monsters, but that's also kind of statically determined and uninteresting.
Right. Yeah.
So, it just wasn't good, Right. And I saw that relatively quickly, although that said, it's possible that I missed something, right? And there would have been something cool there.
But I guess another thing is that you didn't really seem to have trouble coming up with 12 T equals X's. So maybe it was just like, well, I see how to do the T equals X thing. I don't see how to do the T equals Y thing. So do I really need to do the T equals Y thing, right?
Yeah.
And maybe the answer was just no,
that is
why
how
push
it
right?
turned out. And if it didn't turn out that way, I probably
Yeah.
would have looked harder at it, right?
Yep.
Okay, so another thing that I implemented and was in one of the versions of the game, although probably not in the very first one. Again, thinking about the physics basis of the game originally, what are some things about physics at a small scale? Well, things are quantized, right?
Yeah,
And so
there's a lot of stuff about that with like the speed of light moving like in increments or something.
Or like black body radiation,
Yeah.
for example, being only solvable. Like that's how quantum mechanics was discovered, was like if you try to solve the equations for like, when things get hot, what wavelengths should they emit and how much? It was like nonsensical and didn't match measurements,
Okay.
right? And then to match measurements, it turns out like, if you can only give off photons at certain discrete energy levels, then this all works out. And that's actually how they started looking at quantum mechanics.
Which
right?
is mildly terrifying because you don't normally think of things in the real world as being quantized.
But they are.
But
They
off we
totally
go.
are, right?
Okay.
So
God ran out of bits, I guess.
and I don't think that's what happened. But anyway, so
there's a mechanic based on this quantization?
what if,
Or was
since
the
the
mechanic?
game is about time now,
Yeah.
then the quantization would affect time. And so what I implemented was, again, time, the whole game is paused.
Okay.
And then instead of, how you use the arrow keys and you have the jump button, right?
Yes.
Instead of those being continuous inputs, you get this little like control HUD that pops up over your guy that has like the 4 arrows and the jump button.
Oh, I remember this.
And then you hold them down because you might want to go
Yes.
diagonal or something.
Yes.
So or if you just want to go forward, you tap forward and release it, and your guy goes a certain amount, running the continuous simulation for a fixed amount of time.
I see.
Right? If you wanted to go diagonal and jump, you hit all 3 of those and then release them, and he does that.
I see.
Right?
So you kind of, it's like a turn-based braid.
Turn-based, but with the same simulation underneath because,
Right.
I mean, you could invent in a whole entire turn-based version of the game, and
Right.
some people might do that, but
Right.
it didn't seem along the lines of what I wanted to do.
Okay.
Like this wasn't a game where you go into totally different simulators in every world. It was a game where
Right.
it's the same one, but it's modified.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I did that, and again, I had trouble coming up with puzzles and controlling situations to make them interesting. And it was just this mode of having a discrete time step that then played out in a simulation. It was pretty sloppy, and it was hard to even think about what was going to happen. Like, what's a typical thing that happens in this game? Well, there's a monster, maybe he's walking away from you toward a wall, and he's going to bounce off, and then you want to jump on him.
Right.
And in continuous mode, in the beginning, that might be hard to learn, like when to jump and how if you want to bounce off him.
Right.
Right. In this mode, it was way even more awkward to learn.
Right.
And the end result just wasn't good. Like,
Right.
okay, I'm doing this interaction and that's cool, but I'm not getting more out of the interaction than I put in. That's part of the magic of design, right? Is
I
you
see.
find the thing where you do a certain amount of contrivance or a certain amount of setup for the situation, and then you get out of it all these cool things as fuel, as like payload for your game, right?
Oh,
it's
wow.
like splitting a molecule or something, and
I
the
was
energy
just going to
comes
say
out.
that. So
Yeah.
that's a really interesting way to put it, and I don't think I've ever thought about it that way. That's very useful to people who don't know much about game design, such as myself. So basically, what you're saying is you have to think about the design process in almost like you were thinking about a power plant. If it's
Yes.
costing you more to get design things out as what you're actually implementing to put in, you're probably doing something wrong, and you should try to look at a different thing or
Yes.
move to a different space, because all you're going to end up doing is making a very Procrustean thing with not a lot of richness. Is that a kind of fair summary?
Absolutely. And I've played lots and lots of games by people who didn't get that. Because if you follow, there have been presentations at conferences about how do you design games? How do you design puzzle games? And it's like, come up with different mechanics that do things. And it's like, okay, but all these ideas that you put into your game and implement have cost, right? Firstly, your implementation cost, your maintenance cost of making sure that when they interact, forget even the interactions being interesting, but like your game has to survive the interaction of things, right?
Right.
It has to do something that makes sense and is playable.
And you have to have a plan for, can the art represent it and all these other
represent it
effects.
At all, and then in a way that feels like the player can get what's going on, right? Like there's a rule that I have that I think some people understand, which is, if you have a lot of invisible game state, especially in a single player game, it's very hard to play and it's very inscrutable. And so the role of like graphics and sound effects and vibration and whatever else is in part to help communicate that hidden state so that you can learn it better and understand better what's going on. So if you make a bunch of rules with a bunch of weird hidden state, you're making that job very difficult to do and maybe impossible.
You see that, I think, a lot in like RPGs, especially like tabletop inspired RPGs, where like they've implemented this big rule set that like a dungeon master would have been reading from, but it's almost impossible to surface that to a player who isn't familiar with that tabletop game. I've definitely had that experience myself. Like, I don't know how it's determining how much damage this spell is. I have no idea, right? There's numbers everywhere and all this stuff, and it's just like, I believe you that you've got something in there that's doing it. It also kind of reminds me of something from UI design I've noticed separately, which is like the harder it is to program a UI's logic control flow in your code, usually the less good the UI is. Because there's just too much stuff that might be happening for the user to really understand. And,
Oh, we have a lot of bad UI these days.
Okay, well, that all makes very good sense.
The other thing to say about that, right, it's not just these other internal things that I said, but like the other costs are, what does the player have to learn to play your game? And then what do they have to think about to solve puzzles? And what do you have to think about to design puzzles? And these are very insidious costs. Because you can be paying them and not realize it. And that is a thing to avoid. So I've played a bunch of puzzle games. I'm thinking of specific ones that I'm not going to mention. Where there's just a lot of setup of different objects that they, quote, teach you about. And then it's like, here's a level with these things. And what do you do in the level? It's like you just kind of untangle what they set up in the level. And there's no deeper, more enlightening principle to it. There's no surprise. There's no revelation. There's no you getting better at anything aside from untangling messy situations in your head, which after you've done that a couple times, it's just the same thing over and over again, right? And so that is a failure mode that a lot of puzzle games fall into. And the designers of those games do not even see after they've done it that they fell into that. They're just, it's a puzzle game. Look, I made the puzzle game. If you understand, I did the thing where you put the mechanics, you have the things with different mechanics that are combined to solve the puzzle, and here they are in some rooms. And obviously players can sit down and solve this puzzle, so I made a good puzzle game. And it's like, well, no, the good part is very presumptuous, right? Good is difficult, and it is something that we have not done a very good job talking about.
I
really
would agree, because I often look for resources that are good for this sort of thing and don't find them.
I think it's very weird because I think Valve did a lot of damage here.
Really?
Yeah, because a lot of people really liked games like Portal and whatever, right? And they were vocal about how design for those games went. And I mean, really, so Portal 1, I think, is a better game design-wise than Portal 2. Portal 2 is kind of just like a mess
Okay.
that happens when you throw a big team at something, and
Right.
there's not really a coherent vision.
Okay.
I think the reason both games do well primarily is because they're really funny. I think Portal 1 is funnier than Portal 2.
Yeah.
Portal 2 is a lot bigger, so it's like we make up for it in volume.
Right. It's harder
Right?
to be. It's harder to have as much good like story and humor as in a larger game.
I think so. Because Valve has a good reputation or had a good reputation, and a lot of developers are like, if only I could be Valve.
Right.
Right. I think they don't receive the information. I don't want to say critically, but like, anytime, well, okay. If there's someone who's an expert in a topic and you're like a rank beginner and you don't know that much, well, firstly, it's probably a waste of time to get advice from the expert because he's thinking about stuff that you don't even know what it is.
Right. Yeah.
But let's say you're a little bit more, let's say you have base competence. Then if you listen to someone who's like a super expert and has way more experience than you, probably you should just believe whatever they say. Because again, they're just like way better than you.
Okay.
But again, like different experts will tell you different things.
Right.
And so you're already like forming taste by choosing who to listen to and what sounds better.
Right,
but it's very precarious because as a beginner, you don't really know better.
Yeah.
Right?
This happens in programming a lot.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
And then, once you're intermediate, you really should have enough of an opinion that when somebody tells you something, like you shouldn't exactly be doubting them, but you should be expecting that by the time I become as good as this person is at the thing that they do, I would naturally have a different viewpoint and I'm not trying to be an exact clone of this person. In fact, if I want to contribute to this field, I had better be different from them in an interesting way. And I should be trying to surpass them and to surpass them eventually. Like, I don't want to be, egotistical to think that I'm better than them now, but if I want to surpass them eventually, I should be able to see things that they missed or something, right? That's always been my mental model somewhere, right? And so what I perceive, though, is like somebody famous and successful like Valve. I'm personifying Valve now into one thing.
Which they tend to like.
Yeah.
they don't seem to want to be individualistic about it.
No, but they give talks and then like everybody just assumes the talk is amazing and nobody thinks critically about it, like hardly at all.
Right.
And again, I don't mean think critically in terms of like deliberately try to shoot it down, but just like run the ideas, like do more than just accept the ideas as being true, like live in them a little bit and see if you come to the same conclusions. Like ideas should, quote unquote, form together some kind of structure that's internally consistent and doesn't lead to bad outcomes. And leads productively to something that you want. And, if you're an artist, maybe what you want is a little different from what Valve wants. Right. Or, I mean, maybe not, but that means you don't have any ideas, right? So anyway, they had a certain way of talking about puzzles where
I remember this.
They would talk about the aha moment and like that was the goal of a puzzle. And the thing is it's true to an extent.
They also had another thing, if you care to comment on it during this, which is they were like, write the set of objects vertically and horizontally and fill in the squares. So those are the two things I remember them saying explicitly, like things you could explicitly say they were.
Well, when I talked about some of these other games that had bad designs, I was thinking explicitly of that kind of matrix where you fill in the squares. Because that's a very mechanical thing to do.
It is.
And you can do that and you can show that you have done it and then you're done designing. Which is not how you make something good at all.
I see.
I don't know if we want to go. I'm sure most people listening have no idea what we're talking about there. We could go into that maybe in a minute, but to go back to this aha moment thing. Like it is true that puzzles where you just grind away and then you come to some solution and the solution does not feel special in any way,
Yeah.
and you don't know anything new,
Yeah.
those are relatively thankless puzzles that feel like work. And after you
Yeah.
do a bunch of those, you'll like nope out of a game or
Yeah.
whatever, right?
Yeah.
On the other hand, if you solve a puzzle and you're like, oh my God, I get it, right? That is by definition a more enjoyable experience, like a more punchy experience, and it will lead you to liking a game more, right? Now, Valve, the problem is they're very focused on, they think of their game as a product, right? And they're iterating on product design. And so from that standpoint, this whole aha moment thing makes sense because it's the way to get your customer to like your game.
Yes.
Right? And that is all true, right? But I think my standpoint has always been it's missing some things, right?
Yeah.
Both in terms of like, why does your life have meaning if you're a designer of this stuff?
Yeah.
And also so coming up with aha moments, like what is actionable about this, right?
Yeah.
How do I make these things and how do I make them good versus not good?
Yeah. I was just going to add a very slight thing. I don't think it's that important, but I was going to say, like, it's definitely true that for Valve, they actually, when you said, they think of it as a product, they definitely do, and not necessarily even in a cynical way that maybe Apple thinks of something as a product.
Yeah.
They literally are just like, they literally would say, we believe that, like, the economics tells us if we've done a good job supplying value. Like, they literally think of it in almost the way that a commodities producer does. It's like, if people want this product and buy this product, that's how we know we've done a good job. And we are not trying to be, anything more than that. We think that's why we provide value, which is fine, but it's definitely a different approach. Like you said, art game earlier, they don't want that. They're not pretending to do that. They are intentionally doing something else.
Indeed. And in fact, I've never worked there, but in my interactions with people who have, it's pretty clear that, like, they don't believe in the designer who has the good ideas, for example.
Yes.
They believe on iterating on a design by having everybody throw their ideas at the thing, and then, the ideas will fight, and the
market, the playtest market will determine
the meritocracy will determine what the ideas should be in this game. Now, the problem is that's another word for design by committee, sort of. It's a little bit more of a one that contains a playtesting cycle within it. So it's more reality-based than if you just have some random-ass committee deciding things.
It's maybe the best version of design by committee, right?
But it still leads to very boring results, in my opinion, and I think that shows in their recent games, right? There are other companies that I also think things about, good or bad, but they're just one of the major ones, and the one that a lot of people know about, who design a lot. Who designed a couple of major puzzle games, and so it's a good reference point that a lot of people know about. So I don't wish to actually gossip about Valve, but what I do want to say to cap that off is just I felt that the way that they spoke about these things, whereas it was better than nothing, right? Yeah. Combined with the propensity of people to just take what they said and think that that's everything to say on the matter, right? It ended up being a little bit misleading or leaving people in a place that was not good enough to design good games from. Because this whole idea of the aha moment, again, it's true, but it's incomplete. And so what I tell people to think about is, okay, what is that aha moment for, first of all?
Okay.
Is it just to get people to play your game? Is it just the equivalent of, like, in an RPG, we give people a little bit more loot on a certain schedule so that they feel compelled to keep bashing the monsters, right? Or is there more to it, right? Can you, if you think you're an artist, then you should have some opinion about the content of those moments, right? Like, imagine somebody, making a film, and they're just like, or telling you how to make films, and they say, well, there should be one thing. I don't make films, so it's a little bit hard. I'm reaching for this, but like one thing that makes dialogue fulfilling is that when, at some point you have characters get emotional and they reveal things about their personality or whatever, right? So on the one hand, it's like, okay, that's a very general statement. You can take that in a very cynical way that's like, okay, so to make my film interesting, I'm going to do these paced at certain points throughout the running time. And as long as I put them with enough density, then people will sit all the way through the movie, right?
Yes.
And that's kind of what Valve was saying to some extent, right?
Right.
But, okay, so firstly, if I'm an artist, I care about what exactly these characters are and what they're saying to each other and how their personalities interact. And that's what I really should be thinking about. And if I really am thinking about that, then maybe it's not a problem to come up with dialogue that creates these interesting moments because I'm working with the interesting subject matter at a more core level, right? And so then maybe I don't need this tip about making sure interesting things are said. And maybe if I follow the tip about making sure interesting things are said, I'm actually going to make kind of bad scripts, right? Whereas if I'm working with the interesting character material, maybe I just naturally get better scripts, right?
I think at
this is kind of a bad analogy, but
it's not a bad analogy. Because I could probably clean it up a little bit.
Okay.
So in screenwriting, we do have this exact thing, right? I mean, I don't write screenplays, but I mean, they have it. So in screenwriting, you do have this. And I think the problem is people mistake observations about what tends to be true of well-written scripts for prescriptions on how to write good scripts.
Yes.
And I think the same could be said for game design.
This reminds me, you could probably go search this.
Yeah.
Right. There's something that I read. It kept coming up for a couple of years.
Right.
There's like some guy who was like a music producer back in the days of music labels.
Okay.
Right? And he was like, all hit songs have one of the following things. Right. Exactly. And it's like 12 different things, like repeating phrases.
Yeah.
Or like, oh baby in it or something like that. Like so many things like that like you read them and like, yes, they're true of all these songs, but you just pattern matched on what you saw about songs and made a list. Like that's not the same as these things make the song good.
Well, I'm actually saying something a little bit subtler than that. I'll be explicit. So Sid Field wrote a book called Screenplay. It's one of the most famous books in screenwriting history in terms of like its effect on the industry. And this book was the thing that basically codified the 3-act structure for movies.
Yeah.
As a thing everyone was supposed to do. And if you look at what this says, it's like, okay, Act 1 is generally this, Act 2 is generally that, Act 3 is generally this. They tend to break up at about this much time in the movie and all this sort of thing. And what you would take away from that in a positive sense is if you looked at that and said, okay, if I wrote a screenplay and it kind of doesn't fit that well, that might be a good indication that I need to work on it a little bit more because maybe I haven't quite tuned it to fit in a movie format as well as it could or something like this.
Yeah.
The not very positive way to take that, or the thing that would probably make things worse, is when I sit down to make a screenplay, I just literally type in those 3 parts because I've been told that's what makes good screenplay.
And that's going to be horrible.
And that's going to be like most movies you see nowadays where it just feels like someone turned a crank and the climax happened here because that's when Sid Field said it would happen and that's it. And so I do think there is a value to looking at structural things and saying good X tend to look like this.
Yeah.
But that's more of just a litmus test you can employ to see where you're at currently. It's usually not a great idea to go, I'm going to make that intentionally because that means everything's going to feel forced.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, also I think a role for that kind of thing, again, across media and games as well, is to help people who are new, right?
Yes.
If you sit down and you're like, I want to write a screenplay, it's like a bunch of scenes.
Yeah.
If you do that, it's like pretty easy to come up with something that's a mess or not very good.
Yeah.
And then you don't necessarily have a conceptual framework yet for
Why? Yeah.
why is it not good and how do I make it better?
Yeah.
Whereas something like this, it's like, here's a structure of films that works. You could be like, oh, right. Now, I think that kind of thing should be taught loosely as not here is what all things should converge upon, which unfortunately, this seems to be a failure mode of human beings, is they tend to do that with everything, right?
Yes.
But if you keep it loose, like, okay, generally it's like this, but of course there's a lot of freedom around it. But your first goal as someone learning should be to understand why this structure works, what it does that avoids problems and failures.
Exactly.
Right? And then you internalize that, and now you can do it yourself without needing that structure exactly, right?
And usually they're not meant to be Procrustean. Like, there are examples of great screenplays that don't really look quite like the 3-act story structure.
Yeah.
So you know that it's not a requirement. It's just a thing that tends to be a structure that is consumable as a 90-minute to 2-hour thing that humans understand, right?
Yeah.
But it's not. There are other things you could put on the screen, and we know that there are. They're just more rare, right? So it's not even a thing that it has to have. It's just, these things. And the Valve Matrix approach, which I don't really know if it's Valve. I think people had probably done that beforehand. But that sort of idea feels similar to me. This is something that a lot of good games probably do have. You can see that there are a lot of interactions between mechanics, and they're not all just like one-offs or something. But it's not like just if your game does the Matrix thing, then it's good. That's not what is actually going on there, right?
Absolutely not.
So,
So when I do this kind of a thing, right? So The Witness especially is about this kind of surprise that Valve would call an aha moment, right? But Braid also is in a simpler way. And when I do that, like, the fact of the aha moment is fine, but what I'm thinking about is like, what is the actual idea? And why is that actual idea interesting?
right.
And how clearly is the idea communicated in the level? And are there other things about the level that are getting in the way of communicating that idea? And by communicating, I don't even mean necessarily super clearly. That can be a thing that happens, but sometimes you're talking to a player's conscious mind, and sometimes you're talking to their subconscious mind, which is actually way more active than most of us think it is.
Yes.
And is actually responsible for way more of what you do than you think. Like, we have this model that, like, my language decision-making thing, part of my mind, is me. And then the rest of it is just like, I don't know, it's some little thing in the background. It's really the opposite, right? And if you ever doubt that, then just have a conversation where you're saying stuff like I'm saying right now. Fluidly, I'm saying a sentence. And just ask yourself, wait, where do these words come from?
Right.
Am I planning the words?
Right.
If so, can I see the plan?
Yeah.
If it's a conscious plan, where is it?
Yeah.
Right? And so even just regular conversations that you're having all the time, it's much more like they're being produced by something that you have no visibility into, but you make a story that it's intentional and a matter of your moment-to-moment will to say these things.
Right.
Right? And like your conscious mental state is more about deciding or being cool with the fact that you are making these decisions rather than them actually being decisions or whatever.
Well, you can especially see this in like action game things as well, where you're just like, look, if it really was all conscious play, then the instant you know how you should jump on top of this monster head, and you just would. But actually, it's so continuous and complex that it trains up, and after an hour or two of play, suddenly you're like perfect at it without even ever thinking. You just do it.
Yeah.
And there's not really a lot of reason to believe that somehow only action things are getting trained up that way. Like,
Nope.
it would make a lot more sense if everything you do is sort of getting stuff pushed down into the subconscious area where you're having all this head prediction and all these other things. It would be weird if suddenly you stopped having that capability just because it was phrased as a logic puzzle or something.
Yeah, it's
right?
really pretty much most things. Like, one model you could have for it is that the conscious part of your mind that is actually supposedly making decisions in all of this is a relatively low bandwidth piece that is pretty slow and useful.
Yes.
But, can't really handle that much necessarily, right? And so the world is full of information and full of things happening.
Yeah.
And even your body is very complicated. Like, what percentage of what's going on in your body are you controlling consciously? The answer is 0.000, right?
Yeah. I like the precision of that answer, Jon.
I don't think it was precise enough. Okay. But, there are parts of your mind that are participating in that.
Right.
Anyway, the point being, as a designer, you can play with these things. And you can have an interesting time, and you can try to do something, either something purely artistic or something a little more pragmatic or some mix of the two. And it's a very interesting, rich space to talk about it. And I've talked about it in speeches in various ways. My viewpoint is just one viewpoint, right? And I think the problem is that we have a paucity of designers who are even considering any of this. Yeah. Right? And so if you want to hear about people who are doing this kind of stuff, it's like it's a one-digit number of people.
Yeah.
And some of them don't do that much of it. Right. And then even with someone like me, it's like I'm releasing a game every 27 years right now.
Right.
So, it is what it is.
To bring it slightly back to something you said before as well, putting two and two together, it seems to me that one of the things you said earlier about Braid, for example, or at least the decision about what to do there, is you had mentioned sort of you don't really want to compete with AAA because if you're competing with AAA, you're going to lose. You can't put together the kinds of spectacle that they can just on a purely budgetary basis.
Let's get more specific about this so that people know what we're talking about. Okay. You've got a game, and let's say there's some set of things in the game. Now,
Braid, there's keys, gates, monsters, right?
Yes. And we'll talk for a minute about just like noun kind of things. But if you really want to be comprehensive, like there might be like verbs that you can do, like jumping is a verb, not really a noun, right?
Right.
But along one axis, and whether the verbs should be listed in what we're about to say or not, it's sort of two different ways of doing it.
Okay.
The easiest way to think about it is just all nouns, right? So like you might have player is a noun, right? And monster is a noun, like Goomba style monster. I don't want to use that word because it's copyright Nintendo.
Okay.
So I'm going to say monster.
Okay.
It's copyright Italy.
Goomba R.
Yes.
For the circle.
So this idea of good design, quote unquote, with very sarcastic quotes.
Okay.
Not just regular sarcasm quotes.
Okay.
Is that you just want to make sure that any two things interact with each other. And so does player interact with monster? Why, yes, both by jump, right? I could kill the monster, or a monster overlaps with me.
And kills you.
And kills me, right? And so if you make a list of, people have probably seen this kind of matrix where you have, 17 nouns.
Yeah.
You list them both across and down so that everything is cross-referenced to itself along the diagonal.
Like, think of a spreadsheet if you don't know what a matrix is.
Yes.
A spreadsheet where you have the rows and columns. You put all the nouns down the rows and all the nouns across the columns, so now you have a big square.
In the same
order.
Yeah.
You have a big square to fill in.
And the diagonal does this thing interact with itself, which you probably ignore, although maybe not.
Right.
But so then and in fact, everything's redundant because like the upper triangle and the lower triangle are just the transpose of each other. So.
Well, I suppose it depends how you look at it. If it's a transitive action where it's like player acts on Goomba is this, Goomba acts on player
and in
is
fact,
that,
in this
and
case,
it is in this case.
In this case, yes. So it's player acts on Goomba would be via jump.
So it may or may not be symmetric.
And you could put a check there, and then Goomba acts on player, kills the player, you could put a check there.
Exactly.
And the idea is you just want check marks in all the boxes.
Right.
And then you have a design space that is not like dead. And that's true. Like, and in fact, earlier games had a lot of dead design space. So it is the kind of thing that you solve. The problem is, though, it's like you're bringing this conceptual machinery to bear to solve what is kind of an easy problem that anyone who becomes a good designer already intuited.
I see.
You know, like if you have things in a game that don't affect each other, you end up in situations where it feels kind of bad or whatever. And the rule that you can learn that's much simpler than draw this matrix and put all the things in it is just your game is often richer if things affect each other.
And, you know, it seems to me also that it's maybe phrased a little bit poorly or framed a little bit poorly when presented in the matrix format, because it seems to me it's more interesting to just go, look, this is just a good spot check for you to find possibilities. Like if you're sitting around thinking about something and it's like you kind of a little stuck, think about, are there any things that you haven't looked at for interactions, and look at possibilities there, because the thing that doesn't really make sense to me about the matrix formulation is games usually don't quite break down that way. Like in Braid, it would suck if monsters and keys didn't interact. That is a worse game if you took that away.
Yeah.
I don't think I know if anything important happens between the like Goomba going like to a cannon or something like this. Like there's things where I'm just like, I don't know if that matters. And it's like, I wouldn't necessarily think it was bad or good if it did. It's just a possibility.
There are lots of things that don't interact. So for example, bullet shot out of cannon does not interact with key in any way. It does not interact with gate in any way.
Okay.
It does not interact with cloud in any way.
Right.
It doesn't interact with, fire pit full of spikes.
Yeah.
It doesn't interact with stuffed animal dinosaur at the end of the level.
Yeah.
It doesn't interact with book podium.
Right.
And so as we said earlier, this is deliberate for Braid, because actually for the design to be good with regard to the perturbations of the rule set that happen with time, I wanted a stable, simple rule set that was easy to understand. And actually, if I had done this square matrix thing before adding the time rules, I probably would have ended up with a more complicated rule set. And more importantly, one of the things that you get out of that kind of very dense full interaction matrix is like more surprise. Like the player didn't necessarily think that these two objects would interact, and maybe it's not even likely.
Yes.
But then once in a while they do interact.
Right.
And something cool happens and you're like, oh, I should have expected that. And it seems plausible and natural and whatever. And that's enjoyable. I didn't want that.
Right.
I want that to come from the time stuff.
Right.
Not from like the baseline stuff.
Yeah.
And so if you go do that with the baseline stuff, you're like doing too good of a job with the baseline stuff. And you're crowding out. It's like, if you're mixing a song and like you want the guitar solo to be the point, but you're turning the drums way up and like whatever all the other things, right?
Yeah.
Yes. That is sort of a meta point, which is that this particular full interactivity space idea is an idea of how to make a game good, and it is contextual whether you want to do that or not. If you have very sophisticated ideas about what you're doing and you know what you're doing, then you may well do the opposite, in fact. And now, of course, the general heuristic applies that you should know the rules to break the rules, right?
Well, and it's a tool, right? It's like it's something you can use to see what areas you haven't explored, which is useful, as long as you don't feel compelled, right, to fill it all in because you thought that was the point or something.
Absolutely, right? The thing that you said about the matrix thing being a tool, I think that's the correct way to use something like that is, hey, I'm kind of stuck. This design isn't working for me.
Yeah.
You know, sometimes our mind just isn't that good at, sometimes it's very good at like honing in on like exactly what's wrong, but sometimes that's hard.
Yes.
And then you can use a tool like that to just put your attention on every, because this space is very intangible. The space of like what interacts with what.
Yeah.
It's not visible anywhere. And so you could look at this matrix and be like, okay, do I want the bullet shot out of the cannon to interact with the ring, the time control ring?
Yes.
Do I want it to hit the time control ring and bump it sideways or something? In some games, you might. In this game, I did not, because I didn't want the result of any puzzle to be have the bullet bump the time control ring. That would have made a worse game. But in a lot of games, it makes a better game. So, for example, Spelunky, I think, is one of the most successful examples of a game that leverages this kind of multiple object interaction in a way that has a long lifetime through the game that keeps giving you surprises, and that's delightful and funny, even though it usually results in you losing the game. It like feels fair and it feels funny. This is actually, in Spelunky 2, I felt it was mistuned to where the game was just really sadistic and I didn't want to play it.
So something about the first one kind of hit a better...
It worked better for me personally. But yeah, so that kind of thing, again, interesting conceptual tool. Like you should understand the idea of lining everything up in a matrix. Because that's a certain kind of illustration of what it means for things to interact. And if you understand that, then you can use it, as you're saying, as a kind of analytical tool occasionally, right? But the failure mode is to think that the goal is to fill out the matrix with check marks, and not only that that's necessary, but that it's sufficient. And almost everybody thinks that is sufficient. And that's why we get so many bad puzzle games.
And I would also add a separate thing, which is that it seems to me to be both a bad idea to fill the whole thing out, and also insufficient to fill the whole thing out, because when I think about games and try to map it onto that ontology, I don't know why you would a priori say that it's a 2D matrix. What if I want 3 things to interact in some cases, or 4? Or what if I want these 2 things to interact, but I want there to be 5 different ways they interact, whereas this thing over here, there's only 1. And so again, even if you took it as a prescriptive thing, I'm going to go fill out the whole matrix. As a naive game designer, I walk into that and go, I still don't really know exactly what that means, because there's so many other things I've obviously seen in games that don't actually fit that model, even if we talk about filling it all the way in. But
that's what I meant earlier, or it's an example of what I meant by seeing this kind of device and like reading it in, looking at how it fits in this framework with the other things that you know. Right? And then does it make a consistent picture, or to what degree does it make a consistent picture? How seriously should I take it? And a lot of people just don't really run that process. And
So let me ask you to elaborate on one other thing that got said in all of this, just to maybe wrap up this section of what we've been talking about. You said that in this game, the jumps are much shorter than Mario jumps. And that is not an accident, apparently. So why is this the case?
Lots of reasons. So it's over-determined, as we say, which means that even if you got rid of some of these, it would still be correct for the rest of them.
Okay. So you really, really in Braid, for many reasons, want these jumps to be short.
I will start listing reasons.
Okay.
And
as part of the framing, could you also say, how did this come about? Like, did you just throw in a value at first and then it got refined over time? Or like is there any also like procedural aspect? You just not really remember?
Well, so to lay down the ideas, there's this initial fundamental question.
Yeah.
Which is, how does jumping even work mechanically?
Yeah.
Do you press the button and just a jump goes?
Right.
Or do you hold the button and you like jump higher?
Right.
As long as you hold it, which is how Super Mario Brothers works, and was considered to be an innovation at that time that made it a lot more friendly and playable. Like if you go back and play like Lode Runner or whatever, I think Lode Runner had jumping, but whatever, you know, all these old platformer games that had jumping.
Even Donkey Kong, I think it goes a prescribed height.
Yes.
There is a little air control, I think. Is there air control in Donkey Kong? There might not
be
a little
control, bit,
but
maybe, but
it might just be either you jump up or you jump sideways. I'm not sure, but it always went the same height.
But jumping was very limited for a long time, and this, you know, so the Super Mario Brothers jump is both much more controllable, both in terms of like holding the button to control height and air control.
Yes.
Right. And it's also just really big. Like it goes up a large portion of the screen.
Yes.
Which is good if you want to give players a lot of freedom about where to go or what to try. All these are good things. And the more control you give them over the jump, the more they have like recovery from slightly not doing the right thing, which means your levels can actually be harder and people can deal with them. Like you can throw more at them and people can deal with them. So these are all good design decisions in the context of that game.
Right.
Now, again, the problem is people look at that and say, oh, therefore, these are good design decisions, period.
Right.
And that is not how it works.
Right.
So, okay, Braid, different game.
Right.
Firstly, is another aspect of what I already said, which is I wanted the base rule set to be simple.
Right.
I didn't want you to be solving a lot of puzzles with the base rule set.
Right.
Because then we're taking up space that would be used by the time stuff or just muddying it. Like if, okay, there are a lot of things in Braid which are of the form, here's a gap that's too wide to jump.
Right.
Clearly you need to get across it.
Right.
How do you do that?
Right.
And that's already kind of an ambiguous situation. Like if you throw that at a player, they're going to try to jump across the gap a little bit, even if it's way too far, right? So that's problem number one.
Especially if they have rewind, right?
Now, if you give them a tool whereby by holding the button more or less, they can jump further or less far, that makes all of those situations both harder for you to design because you have to make it so that the really far jump not only can't cross the gap, but obviously can't cross the gap because it has to be clear to people that they shouldn't be trying to do that. Right. And you're muddying the situation for the player because any situation they're in, they're like, what are the tools that I have to solve this puzzle with? And one of the tools is always going to be the jump button. And that's true in Braid too, but the jump button in Braid does one very simple, well-defined thing. And the less simple and the less well-defined it is, just the less clear in any context that it is to the player whether it's part of the right answer. That's like how you figure out puzzles is you maybe put forth propositions in some way, like maybe it's this, maybe it's that. And some of those you can discount right away. Like, oh yeah, clearly no, because I can't jump that far. And, and the less clear you make that, the harder you make the general puzzle solving process across the entire game, right? So for example, also there's a little bit of momentum on the Braid character movement. There's some speed up and there's a much faster like slow down to stop because you don't want to feel like you're skidding on ice all the time, right? Having no momentum feels really bad. It feels like a crappy indie game, right? Having a lot of momentum, it starts to be a factor in puzzle solving. Like if I already start running before I throw the switch, I can get to the target place sooner than if I throw the switch and then start running. And that's the kind of thing, I don't want that in the solution space of this game ever. I don't want a puzzle where you solve it by already being running when you throw the switch, because that's not about time. That's about like your running mechanics, right?
Right.
And so all of the design of the player mechanics was about this, right? It was about pre-curating it. Before I even know what all the puzzles are going to be exactly, it's about pre-curating it to be simple and not to cause problems. Okay, that's number one.
Right.
Reason number two.
And so basically all of that stuff you just said, it's very clear. It's like, okay, in Braid, the goal is not really to replicate any of the gameplay from Super Mario Brothers. Super Mario Brothers is about doing these action puzzle sequences where giving players really interesting controls is part of creating the richness of that space.
Yes.
In Braid, the idea is you're supposed to be logically kind of like figuring out what is the correct sequence of events here, not sitting around spending a lot of time figuring out just how to do the air control to like go up through the thing or something like that. So these design decisions are basically have to be different in Braid because the type of thing the player is supposed to be doing is just drastically different.
Yeah, and like the conceptual focus of the game is in a totally different place, right?
Yeah.
And you need, as a designer, to be maintaining that at all times.
Okay. So number two.
Okay, number two. Decided early on, Braid's a puzzle game. It's not an action game, as you just said. What are puzzles like in this universe? Well, they're pretty much, it's hard to get somewhere. And so the goal is get to that place. And the way we indicate that place is by putting a collectible there or a key or something.
Right.
And that's how you know that you successfully got to the place. All right. Now, I think I already, to some degree, although this became further refined as I kept working on the game, but to some degree I knew I wanted puzzles that are relatively simple in the sense that they're not like all a set of 17 steps, and that's what makes them hard, is to figure out the order and the timing for the 17 steps. Because again, that's probably not about cool time manipulation stuff exactly.
Okay.
Like any game can make you do 17 things in order to solve a puzzle. And once you've solved a couple of those, if it's only about figuring out the order and number of things to do, that just gets boring. Those situations are isomorphic to each other very quickly, right? So I had some sense that it's like, I want to focus on the time stuff. And so I don't want the puzzles to be massively complicated. I want them to be as simple as I can make them while highlighting the cool thing. And again, that became more refined during development, but I believe I had that idea in the beginning. And so once you have that idea, you're like, okay, well, also, what is it about puzzles? Often they're hard, right? What makes a puzzle hard? There's kind of two classes of things. There are things that are on focus to what you're trying to achieve, and there are things that are off focus, right? Things that are on focus that make a puzzle hard is like, well, I'm not used to thinking about time behaving in this way, and there are some consequences of it that I haven't visualized yet.
Right.
So I'm having a hard time solving the puzzle because I don't realize that there's some effect that I can bring to bear.
Right.
And as a designer, you have control over like how much you hint that or whatever.
Right, right.
But when people realize that it's on topic, it's like, oh, that's what the game's about. Now I understand more about the time thing, right?
Right.
Something that's off topic is, well, this puzzle's hard because I'm trying to think about it. And again, there's a lot of steps, and keeping that in my mind like a chess master is very hard for me because I'm not a chess master.
Right, right.
Another one that I was thinking about very heavily early is, this is all about jumping, I promise. I can't see the whole puzzle, right? There's like some stuff off the screen to the left and to the right and up.
Right.
And I'm kind of trying to remember all these elements.
Right.
That makes a puzzle much harder than I can just look at the screen and see all the things.
Right.
And so early on, I had this idea that I wanted a puzzle to fit on a screen because that removes a lot of this incidental difficulty, right?
Right, right, right.
So that leads to compact designs that are simpler in terms of number of walls and number of rooms and whatever.
Right.
But also, we've now stated two constraints. we've said, puzzles are about it being difficult to get to a particular place, which often, reading between the lines, this is a game with gravity and you jump and platforms.
Right.
And so
Right.
usually up is hard.
Right.
Right?
Yes.
Or across to some place that is separated by something you would fall down through.
Right.
Okay? And we want puzzles to fit on one screen.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? So the height that you jump
Right.
determines how interesting the puzzles can be.
Right.
And it needs to be short enough that you can fit a puzzle of the interest level that you want, of the maximum interest level that you want, on one screen.
Okay.
Right? If that's not true, if you jump half the screen, then a puzzle could only ever be like 2 jumps max.
Yeah, you could almost see this in something like going from Donkey Kong. I never thought of it this way, but in going from Donkey Kong to Super Mario Brothers, if you had the Super Mario Brothers jump in Donkey Kong, the entire game would take 2 jumps. You just jump to the mid-level, then you jump right to the top, right? So you can immediately see, like, the complexity that you want on one screen tells you exactly how high the jump can be, because if it's higher than that, you can't make the game.
Yeah.
Like, literally.
Yeah.
Right?
Now, okay, so everything that I just said here is very particular to Braid specifically.
Right.
But the meta skill that I would encourage people to develop is a priori, while figuring out what your game is, to be able to see enough of this kind of constraint for your domain that you're working in, that you then can do something much closer to the right thing out of the gate than you would otherwise, right?
Yeah.
There is this old idea in games, and it seemed true at the time when people were saying this. The idea was, you can design a game, but the first time a player actually meets your game, the play test result is going to be totally different than anything you ever expected. And that's why you have to play test and iterate. And you can't really a priori design. And that's a little bit true, but it's actually not that true. Like, if you're a good designer, you actually should kind of know what's going to happen.
I, in fact, remember you saying this. You did a podcast for the Notion podcast. I think it's a note-taking app or something. And you literally said something to the effect, I thought this was really interesting, so I wrote it down. You said, I usually can actually, at this point now, with this amount of experience I usually can get pretty close. Early on, when I first started doing games, which was in the 90s, I had no ability to do that. My brain didn't work that way, so somehow I absorbed it by doing a bunch of game stuff. You were talking.
Whenever I hear quotes from myself, I get annoyed by how unspecific the sentences are that I'm saying. It sounds like a bunch of vague.
But that's what happens when people talk,
I know,
right?
I know.
As opposed to write.
Yeah.
And so to me, I took that as like, oh, okay, Jon perceived what you just said about playtesting. You perceived that to sort of be the case early, but at some point, you crossed over into like having done so much thinking about it that now it's just not that surprising what players do anymore. Is that a correct reading of that? Like, over time, you just feel like you guess better about what a player will do?
With 2 important caveats.
Okay.
Right? One is, I'm not really talking about people who have never seen a video game before and who pick up the gamepad and say, hello, computer, into it or whatever, right?
Hello. Hello, computer.
That's
so
a very generational
mouse,
reference.
If you're talking into the mouse, this doesn't count. For everybody else.
And then the second one is, you are assuming a cooperative player who wants to work with you to have a good time.
Right.
Because, of course, you can have an antagonistic player.
Yes.
And that's a different thing.
Yeah.
But, it's definitely, it gets harder the more unconventional it is what you're doing, and the more experimental relative to previous games is what you're doing. But generally speaking, it is a skill that can be built, and you do not have to be going in blind, right? You can make these kind of choices and use them to generate a good experience that mostly works the way you thought. Like the example that I was probably talking about in that podcast, that was a watershed moment for me in the sense that I designed a whole thing, which was the introductory area of the witness, which is a closed off area where inside you're sort of learning how the game works.
Mm-hmm.
And then we let you out into an open world after that, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so it's like a smaller open world, but very small, right? And I just designed that like in a week and programmed it and all. Like, it doesn't take that long to design, but like programming it, iterating it, whatever, without any kind of playtesting. I was just like, I think someone's going to come over here and they're going to see this and they're going to wonder about that.
Yeah.
And then I, play tested it, quote unquote, at PAX.
I remember that.
Where I just dropped the game down, completely unsupervised. Like the station was like unmanned, apparently.
Yes.
Like I was hanging out in the shadows watching it.
Yes.
It was in a booth shared with Chris Hecker and Andy Schatz's game, which I think was Monaco at that time, but
I think it was.
I feel like, yeah, okay. And they were each trying to draw big crowds, so it was kind of like crowding out the little witness station that had nobody manning it. Because to create space, I would have had to be there, right? And I didn't. I wanted like this mysterious thing. So lesson was, don't ever do that in a shared booth if you want to create that effect. But nevertheless, during times when it wasn't totally crowded out, people came up and played the game.
Yeah.
It would sort of it had a timer where if it was idle for,
a minute or something.
A minute, it would put up a warning, and then after another minute, it would restart, right? If there was no further input. And so it just ran itself. And it would restart from the beginning in the hallway. It's basically like the game is right now. It's a little bit less polished.
Yeah.
Where you walk down a hallway, you do a panel, you're in this area, and basically everybody who played it like I thought it would go.
Yeah. Yeah.
And got out into the game and then sort of knew what they were doing in the game. Yeah. And to be further explicit, there are no words anywhere in this opening sequence. No. It's like just visual things that you notice and then go interact with, right? And that was great. Like, I didn't exactly know that would work. If it had failed, it would have been a relatively low risk thing.
Right, yeah.
I could have always come up and helped people or something.
Right, yeah.
But it just worked. And that was an existence proof for me that, like, okay, this is, not only are we doing really weird, unusual game design here that people need to learn stuff, but that amount of learning can happen rapidly, consistently.
And predictably.
Yes, and predictably and without words, right? I wish that I could make that, like, that's a lesson that was very, very clear for me that I wish I could communicate to other designers convincingly. But if you didn't like have that experience, it's like you hear someone tell you that and you're like, okay, whatever. It doesn't land the same way, right? But to bring it back to Braid, I was sort of just iterating on stuff that I had seen initially in Braid, right? Like, there's something about a platformer level that's very simple and easy to read, right?
Yeah.
Features tend to be meaningful.
Yeah.
And yeah, like by the end of Braid, I was just very interesting in this communication property or this aspect of communication that I'd seen in the levels. And I wanted to do a whole game about that. And that's where that came from.
So are we done with the list of reasons that the Braid jump has to be shorter or not? Because you listed sort of 3, basically, but I don't know if there was a 4.
Those are the main ones. It's mostly the conjunction. The fact that there's an and there between puzzles are about getting places and you need to see the whole puzzle. That's the biggest one.
That's the biggest one.
There's probably a bunch of other smaller things that contribute as well, right? Even just dexterity in some sense. Like, the holding down the Mario button thing is in that game, unless you're playing it at a super high level, which of course you can go on the internet and watch videos of people doing this.
Yes.
In that game, it actually helps people with a variety of dexterity levels relative to the game because, again, you just have more malleability in what you're doing and how you're responding to situations. But in a puzzle game, it's like it only adds dexterity in some sense because it's like, oh, I need to jump this high to get to the puzzle.
So I have to
So I have to hold it at least this long, and
Right.
maybe if I don't totally do that,
Right.
I can't solve the puzzle, but I should be able to by just holding down the button, right? It's like, that's a different way to get at what I was saying before, but it really is a different phenomenon. Like what I
Yeah.
was saying before was that the puzzle's not about holding down the button. And now what I'm saying is holding down the button should not be a way to fail the puzzle, right?
Right.
Like
Yeah.
I don't, so one other aspect that I focused on early on in terms of what the game is about that I was not completely successful with, but for the time I was
Okay.
the following thing. Not only is this a puzzle game, not an action game, but what does that mean? Let's come up with a strong statement about what that means, because
Okay.
the stronger and clearer the statement, the more it can guide design decisions. Whereas the statement, this is a puzzle game, not an action game, is not necessarily, again, actionable in the
Right.
sense that
Yeah.
there still needs to be some more steps between that and telling you the answer to decisions,
Right.
right? So here's a stronger version of that statement, which I very explicitly formulated to myself.
Okay.
Because it is a puzzle game, not an action game, once you figure out the answer to a puzzle, you should then just be able to solve the puzzle. There should not be an action element that is hard that you also need to be able to do to solve the puzzle.
I
right?
see.
And then, so that's a statement about solutions. And then you can walk that one step to what do you do as a player who doesn't know the solution? You attempt solutions.
Right. Yeah.
If you have a concrete idea about what solution you are attempting, it should not be dexterity based to the greatest extent possible. It should
Right.
simply be that you try the thing. Now, I think in the game as it stands today, this was not completely successful just because you watch people who are new at the game, they're trying to jump on a monster's head, they miss or whatever, like all these things happen.
Well, we also know for a fact, because it has now been documented indelibly,
That Brian
that
Moriarty,
Brian Moriarty could
finish
not
it.
finish Braid, despite being one of the people who has played more hours of The Witness than anyone on planet
Yes.
Earth, because he could not successfully jump on one of the bounce, not Goombas, because that's
Yes.
trademarked, monsters.
Yes. Now, he may just be much less of an action gamer than most people as well.
Maybe.
Also, though, standards are really different today than even they were back then. Like in the 2000s, there were hard platformers. And if you go back to the 80s or the 90s, platformers were really hard and tweaky because that was just the only way to get gameplay out of them, really. Like,
Yeah. Also, there's probably an expectation in 2008, because there hasn't been the iPhone gaming scene and all these other things, that anyone who would find a sure-to-be esoteric game like Braid, which is
Yeah.
probably what you're thinking when it comes out,
Yeah.
will be a relatively accomplished gamer. That
Yeah.
turned out not to be the case, but at the time, no one would have thought like, oh, all of these potentially casual gamers might check this out, or that isn't what anyone would have been thinking. Probably,
Yeah, but
right?
and so what I would just say is this decision was successful, and I did this statement about there shouldn't be an action barrier to solving things was very clearly successfully executed relative to the
Right.
platformers of 2000 to 2005, which
Yeah.
were like very hard, made for gamers
Yep.
and whatever,
Yeah.
right? And it's just, sometimes these things are just hard, right?
Yes,
Now,
yes.
there are also other design parameters to this, right? So, for example, how could you make it easier to jump on monsters? Well, maybe if I slow them down so that it's more like they're in one spot and they move slowly,
Right.
it's easier to target because you're sort of more targeting a space on the ground
Right.
than where they are. The problem is that has a pacing effect across the entire game.
Yes.
Now, anytime anybody's solving a puzzle, it takes a lot longer and
Yes.
is slower and all this stuff, right?
Yes.
And then, like, okay, I have a certain amount of space for rewind buffers. If that's like 20 minutes on the most complicated level, if it takes 3 times as long for the monster to go, that's effectively 6 minutes, right? It starts getting scary. Like these
Yeah.
kind of things happen. So I think I did a good job given the context I was working in.
Yeah.
But I don't think you can objectively say that there's no
Right.
action skill required
Right.
to solve puzzles,
Right.
because there definitely is.
Yes.
It's just not that much compared to what it would have
Could
been in
have
another
been, yeah.
game,
Yeah.
or what it would have been if I had decided that this was an action game.
Right.
Right?
Right.
Yeah. In this episode, Casey Muratori asked the questions, Jonathan Blow answered the questions, Jason Brisson produced, and Will Torbett edited. Thanks very much, and we'll see you next time.